A man named John Dodge leased a private railroad car that winter. It was called the Commonwealth, and he had taken it for the season to carry his family down to Florida once the New York Auto Show was over. He never made that trip. On the 14th of January 1920, at 10:30 at night, John Dodge died in a room at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York, his younger brother Horace at his side. He was 55 years old. He had come to New York for a car show and caught the influenza that turned to pneumonia inside a week. The private car he had leased for a holiday made the journey to Detroit anyway. It carried his funeral party. His body rode home a different way, in the baggage car of an ordinary train. A man who had just made one of the great American fortunes went back to the city that made him packed in with the freight. Everybody knows the name. It is stamped on trucks across the country, 100 years after the two men who built it were gone. Here's the part almost nobody knows. The company those two brothers created would one day sell for the largest pile of cash anyone had, to that point, ever paid for anything, $146 million, and neither brother would live to see a single dollar of it. They did not die poor. They died rich men. What they never saw was the record deal their own name would fetch 5 years after both were in the ground. This is the story of how that money came and how it walked out the door and left them behind. Rewind to the beginning. John and Horace Dodge came out of Niles, a small town in the southwest corner of Michigan, the sons of a machinist. There were two of them, red-headed, fierce, and independent, and to each other, inseparable. They drank hard together on the weekends and seldom fought anyone, because they kept to their own company and no one else's. Remember that last part. It comes back. In 1903, a new company in Detroit needed parts, and it needed them from the best machine shop in the city, which by then belonged to the Dodge brothers. The company was the Ford Motor Company, and its founder was a man named Henry Ford. The brothers agreed to build him the running gear of his automobiles, the engine and the transmission and the axles mounted on a frame, at $250 a set. Then something happened that made them rich. Ford could not pay. The new company was long on ambition and short on cash, and it fell behind on its bills month after month. Ford Motor was forever behind in what it owed, and the money it kept failing to pay, it owed to the Dodge brothers. So in June of that year, the Dodges made an unusual deal to settle the matter. They agreed to forgive $7,000 Ford already owed them, and to hand him $3,000 more in credit on top of it. $10,000 in all, and not 1 cent of it in cash. In return, they took 10% of the Ford Motor Company. That 10%, that piece of paper handed over to square a debt a struggling carmaker could not settle, would return the Dodge brothers more than $32 million. A debt Ford owed them turned into a tenth of Ford itself. Hold that number in your mind, because everything that follows hangs off it. The contracts the brothers signed in 1903 and the 10% of Ford they took to clear a debt were the seed of the whole thing. That stake and those contracts would throw off more than $32 million by the end of the decade, and that money, in its turn, would build a second company, one that carried the brothers' own name on the hood. That second company is the one that sells, in the end, for $146 million in cash. Watch the shape of it. $10,000 of forgiven debt, more than $32 million in return. A whole new company raised on the proceeds, and at the far end a check bigger than any the country had yet written. 4 steps, and every one of them dwarfs the step before it. Now it is worth being careful about the chain here because it is easy to get wrong. The 1903 paper did not pay the widows the record sum. It paid for the factory that did, and by the time that fortune came, the two men who planted the seed had been dead 5 years. Everything from here is the story of that chain pulling tight. For 10 years, the arrangement made everyone money. The Dodges built the working guts of the Ford sold the cars, and the dividends and the contract profits rolled into Detroit by the millions. But there was a danger buried inside it, and in 1913, a lawyer put his finger on it. His name was Howard Bloomer, and he handled the brothers' legal work. The way the man who ran their advertising later told the story, Bloomer sat the two of them down in downtown Detroit and asked a plain question. "Why don't you brothers build your own car?" John Dodge answered that they were doing fine as they were. The Ford contracts were rich, the Ford dividends were richer, and neither of them wanted the headache of selling automobiles to the public. And Bloomer warned them of the thing that turned out to be the whole lesson of their lives, that their total dependence on Ford could ruin them. Everything they had rested on one man. If that man ever decided he no longer needed them, they would be left with nothing. The brothers went home. The next day they came back and admitted the lawyer was right. They had already worked out what kind of car they wanted to build, not a cheap one. Ford had built his car to sell cheap and would not hear a word about changing it, and the Dodges believed they could do better than that. They set out to build, in their own phrase, a real automobile. Their aim was not to beat Henry Ford at the bottom of the market. They were going to climb up above him. In 1914, a Model T sold for a little more than half the price of the Dodge's car. They were building for the man who wanted a real automobile and could pay for one, and they were staking their whole future on the bet that such men existed in numbers. So they broke with Ford. In the summer of 1913, John Dodge resigned as a director and vice president of Ford, and the brothers set about building the plant for their own car. The first Dodge Brothers automobile came off the line in Hamtramck on the 14th of November, 1914. It went from 370 cars in that first stub of a year to 145,000 a few years on, and by the end of the decade, only Ford sold more cars in America. But the brothers still owned their 10% of Ford, and in 1916, Ford stopped paying the dividend. He announced he would keep the company's enormous profits, pour them into new factories, and pay his stockholders nothing extra at all. Keep your eye on that 10%. 2,000 shares of the Ford Motor Company, sitting in the brothers' names, bought years before for a debt Ford could not pay. Not a dollar of it had ever changed hands as cash. And that paper, that unpaid bill turned into ownership, is about to do something no one in America had managed to do. It is about to beat Henry Ford inside his own company in open court. What happened next happened fast, and it happened on a ladder, each rung higher than the last. By the late summer of 1916, the Ford Motor Company was sitting on a cash surplus of $52 million on a company whose books were valued at only $2 million. In an ordinary year, the men who owned that company could have expected at least $25 million of it paid out to them in dividends. Henry Ford intended to pay them nothing, and to spend the whole of it on steel and brick. In the last days of October 1916, his directors committed that surplus to building the largest factory in the world, down on the River Rouge. On the 1st of November, Henry Ford's son Edsel was married. On the 2nd of November, the morning after the wedding, John and Horace Dodge sued him. Their complaint charged that by starving the stockholders of the dividends they were owed and burying the cash in new plants, the necessary result would be, in their words, the destruction of competition. The accusation underneath it was plain. Henry Ford was using money that belonged in part to them to build an empire, and that empire would leave no room for anyone else. Before the case ever reached a verdict, the brothers tried twice to get out. In January of 1917, they offered to sell Ford their entire stake for $35 million. Ford answered that he had no desire for any more stock. That summer they set a price on it a second time, all 2,000 shares, $36 million, $18,000 a share, to anyone in the country who cared to buy. No one did. Twice they had named their price to the one man who could most afford to meet it, and twice he had turned them down flat. There was nothing left to try. So the thing that neither side wanted, and that both sides had walked straight into with their eyes open, arrived at last. The mightiest industrialist in America, and the two men who owned a tenth of his company, were going to court. America likes to tell a story about Henry Ford, that he built the automobile business alone with his own two hands. The record says otherwise. For the whole first decade of the Ford Motor Company, the engine, the transmission, and the axles of a Ford, the whole working machine, but for the wheels, tires, and body, were built by the Dodge brothers. And the men who built them had owned a tenth of Ford since 1903. There's a smaller myth too. People say the Dodges invested $10,000 in Ford. They did no such thing. They forgave a debt Ford could not pay and threw in a little more credit, and that is what bought them their tenth. That 10th was about to go into a courtroom in the most famous shareholder lawsuit in American history, and the court would order Henry Ford to pay out a dividend of over $19 million. It would win the brothers themselves, on their 10th of it, only about $2 million. Through 1917, Henry Ford took the stand in his own defense. Asked what the Ford Motor Company was organized for, if not to make a profit, Ford answered that it was organized to do as much good as we can, everywhere, for everybody concerned. Pressed later in the same questioning, he allowed that he was, in his own word, incidentally, making money. In February of 1919, the Michigan Supreme Court handed down its decision, in a sentence that has echoed through American business ever since. A business corporation is organized and carried on primarily for the profit of the stockholders. The powers of the directors are to be employed for that end. The Dodges had beaten Henry Ford. And here is what Ford did about it. Before the ruling even came, he had quit as president and let it be known he might walk away and build a cheaper car under a brand new company, a threat meant to scare his shareholders into selling to him cheap. It did not work on the Dodge brothers, but in July of 1919 they sold anyway. Ford bought back every share he did not already own and paid the brothers $12,500 for each of their 2,000 shares, $25 million. They had won the case and then handed him the stock. So stop a moment and put yourself in their place. You have just done what no one else in America had done. You have taken Henry Ford to court and won. And here he comes with an offer for the very stock that beat him. $25 million to walk away and be done. Would you take it? Or would you hold that paper forever, just to know you owned a piece of the man who tried to squeeze you out? Hold on to your answer. It turns out to be the whole question of the story. They took the money, and here the story turns dark, faster than either brother could have seen it coming. We began at the Ritz-Carlton in January of 1920 with John Dodge dead of pneumonia at 55. That was the older brother. He and Horace had gone to New York together for the auto show, and they had fallen ill together, in the same city, in the same week. John did not recover. Horace almost did. He was the younger of the two, and he pulled through the same pneumonia that took John and went south to Palm Beach to get his strength back. For a while it looked as though it had worked. He came back up to Detroit in the spring, well enough to do a little work, well enough to give his daughter away at her wedding in June, well enough to sit as a delegate at the Republican convention that summer. Then, in August, he collapsed a second time, and after that he did no more work at all. He spent the last 4 months of his life in his house on the ocean in Florida. On the 10th of December 1920, Horace Dodge died there. He was 52. Now, the cause of that death was argued over at the time, and it is worth being careful about, because the easy version is not the true one. The death certificate is not vague. It was signed by the doctor who had sat with him the last week, and it gives the cause as cirrhosis of the liver, a condition he had carried for 2 years. Remember the two brothers who drank hard every weekend and kept their drinking to each other? This is the bill for it, come due 20 years on. But there is one more document, and it is the one that tells you what happened inside Horace Dodge. On the 27th of January 1920, 13 days after his brother died, Horace sat down and wrote a letter to the men who sold Dodge automobiles across the country. In that letter, he wrote of John that his passing was a loss so great that I hesitate to look forward to the years ahead without his companionship. He wrote those words in January. He was dead by December. The certificate names his liver. The letter names something the certificate has no line for. You may set the two of them side by side and decide for yourself which one it was. This is where almost every telling of the Dodge brothers ends. Two red-headed men who came out of a Michigan machine shop, took a tenth of Henry Ford, beat him in their state's highest court, and then died inside 11 months of each other, both before either turned 56. A sad ending, and a fine place to close the book. Except the book is not closed. Because the real story, the one almost no one tells, is not about the brothers at all. It is about the two women they left behind, and what they did with what the brothers built. In January of 1925, the two widows put Dodge Brothers up for sale. More than a dozen offers came in. The winning bid came from a Wall Street banking house, Dillon, Read & Company. That number was $146 million, and every cent of it was cash. The newspapers of the day called it the largest single cash transaction in the country's history up to that time, and no one in 1925 could name a bigger. On the 1st of May, in 2 rooms held open on a long-distance telephone line, one in New York and one in Detroit, the deal was closed. In New York, the bankers wrote a certified check to Dodge Brothers for the full amount. A man endorsed it, telephoned Detroit to say he had it in his hand, and the deed to the company changed places with the check. That check still exists, and a copy is hung in a museum where people have stood and looked at it. It is dated the 1st of May, 1925. John Dodge had been dead 5 years and 3 months. Horace Dodge had been dead 4 years and 5 months. The check cleared, and neither man was alive to see it. Now watch what one of them did with the money, because this is the heart of the whole thing. Anna Dodge was Horace's widow, and the thing that protected her fortune for the next half-century was not anything she did, it was something her husband had done before he died. Horace had taken a large part of their money and put it into municipal bonds, the safe, tax-free kind that a city pays out year after year without fail. Her income off those bonds was reported at more than $1.5 million a year, tax-free for the rest of her life. She lived on what it threw off, and what it threw off was a fortune on its own. Think about what that means. The lock that held the Dodge money together for 50 years was set by a man who did not live to see it work. Horace built the structure, and then he was gone, and the structure did the rest. The other widow, Matilda, took a different road with hers, and poured millions into a great house out north of the city. Both fortunes survived. Both, in the end, were held by something built to outlast the person who built it. So let us run the arithmetic on a single one of these fortunes from the very beginning. It starts at $10,000 in 1903, and not even $10,000 in cash, remember, but a forgiven debt and a line of credit. That $10,000 became a return of more than $32 million by the end of the war. That money built the company that sold, in 1925, for $146 million in one check. Divide that check by the 500,000 shares of Dodge Brothers, and you get $292 a share to the dollar. Each of the 2 widows held just under half the company, so each of them walked away with just under $73 million. $73 million to each of 2 women in 1925. Adjusted for inflation using the Consumer Price Index kept by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that $146 million comes to about $2.7 billion in today's money, which puts each widow's share in the money you carry in your pocket now at something close to $1.33 billion apiece. From $10,000 of forgiven debt to $73 million each. That is the whole climb laid out in 4 numbers. But numbers do not tell you what becomes of the people who inherit them. Watch the 2 heirs, one fortune behind both, and see how far apart the endings fall. Start with the ruin. Horace Dodge had a son, Horace Jr., and by every telling, he is the one who blew the family fortune. The speedboats, the 5 marriages, the drinking that earned him the name, the only Dodge that runs on alcohol. But here's the truth the easy version misses, and it is stranger and sadder than the tale of a spendthrift heir. Horace Jr. never inherited a dollar of it. His father had left him no money of his own. Everything ran through his mother, Anna, and it was Anna who decided what he got. That $73 million was hers, not his. He spent his whole life on an allowance she handed out, running boats she paid for, and when he died, he was deep in debt to her, having borrowed from his own mother again only weeks before the end. He died in 1963. The accounting of what he left behind has come down to us as $2 million, a photograph of a nude, and 9 cars. He did not squander a great fortune. He spent 43 years waiting on one that never arrived, and died owing money to the woman who was holding it. The very structure that protected the Dodge fortune protected it from him too. Now the other ending. Anna Dodge, Horace's widow, lived on and on. She outlived her husband by half a century, and she outlived both of her own children. She lived until 1970 in a great house on the lake, and by the time she died, she was counted among the richest women in America, the fortune still whole, 50 years after the man who made it was gone. The bonds he had bought were still paying. The lock still held. There is one more grave in this family worth marking, and then we are done with the dying. John Dodge had a son named Daniel, 21 years old, married just 13 days, on his honeymoon in the summer of 1938. He and a caretaker were fooling with old dynamite left over from building the family lodge on an island up in Canada. It went off. Daniel did not die in the blast. He died in the water, drowned, when he went overboard on the boat carrying him to a doctor. 21 years old and married under a fortnight. Even the ones the money did not ruin, it could not save. So who kept their fortune in the end? Not the brothers who won in court. The family that kept theirs is the family they beat, the Fords. And how the Fords did it is the lesson this whole story exists to carry. Henry Ford did not start out owning the company that carries his name. In 1903, he held about a quarter of it, a minority stake, and another man sat as its president. He took majority control in 1906, and in July of 1919, the same summer he wrote the Dodge brothers their $25 million check, he and his family bought out every last outside shareholder and owned the whole of it outright. The men who beat him in court were the very men he was buying out. Then, in 1936, facing a new tax that would have forced his heirs to sell the company just to pay the bill on it, Ford split the stock into two kinds. One kind of share owned the company, the other kind voted it. He gave away the first, and he kept the second. When Ford went public in 1956, that arrangement carried straight through, and it has held from that day to this. To this day, the Ford family controls about 40% of the vote while owning only a few percent of the shares. Notice what that is. It is not winning a lawsuit. It is not a great man on a witness stand. What holds a fortune, in the end, is a structure built to outlast the men who set it up, that keeps one family in control long after any single one of them is gone. The Dodges won the fight, the Fords built the machine, and the machine is still running. Here's what the Dodge brothers leave you with. They won every fight they ever picked, their own poverty, the biggest carmaker in the world, and then that same man once more inside his own courtroom. They beat every one of them. They were fierce and they were fearless, and they were, the two of them together, close to unstoppable. And in the end, it did not matter. Because there is one fight that no one has ever won, and it is the only fight that counts. It is time. Time took John at 55 and Horace at 52, before either of them could spend $1 of the great deal their name would fetch. What outran time was not the men. It was the thing they left behind them. The company, the bonds, the structure, the machine that went on working after the hands that built it went still. The brothers made the fortune. But the fortune only lasted because, at the very end, something stood in their place that time could not kill. That is the whole lesson, and it is worth more than $146 million. Build the thing that outlasts you, because you will not. Somewhere near you, a truck is rolling down a road with the name Dodge across the back of it. It has outlived the men by 100 years, the way John Dodge's private railroad car outlived the man who leased it. He took the Commonwealth to carry his family to Florida. It carried his funeral party instead, and his body rode home with the freight. 5 years on, a check for $146 million was written for the company he built, and he was not there to sign it, cash it, or even know. The name rolls on. The men are a century gone. And the fortune is exactly where two widows put it. The family that beat them, the Fords, kept their fortune for 100 years, and they did it with the one weapon the Dodge brothers never thought to build. Another American family managed the same trick, and how they did it is on your screen right now.